welcome again to another edition of the Southwest Climate Podcast. As always, I'm here with Mike Crimmins.
Zachary, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How
Good.
about you?
I'm good.
Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too.
November. We're zipping right along.
We are.
Only 7.5 more months until the monsoon.
Let's get the countdown clock going.
Oh, I miss the monsoon.
I know, me too. Yeah, what happened? We're going to still talk about that?
No, we're not going to talk about the monsoon, but the last month, in terms of precipitation.
Were you here?
I was here.
Okay, good.
But I don't remember anything.
Well, it's not. No.
Nothing to remember.
Nothing to remember.
That's the point. This episode, we want to recap what happened in the last month or so.
Yep.
Which will probably take us, a couple minutes.
It won't take long, that's for sure.
Maybe recap what happened last year, because last year could be an analog for this upcoming year in the sense that last year was a weak La Niña event, and we're on the cusp of another weak La Niña event. So
hope and pray we get at least last year repeated.
Well, if California got last year repeated,
ooh yeah,
they had an epic year in precipitation and snowfall. Yeah, so we'll do a little recap and we'll look forward our sort of standard recipe here.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can characterize October for a large swath of the Southwest as bone dry.
Bone dry. Yep.
In fact, the western 2/3 of Arizona did not receive any precipitation.
Yeah, we have rain loggers, volunteer backyard observers that I was combing over their data in Arizona, and most of them had goose eggs for the month. There were a couple of lucky rain loggers who caught some precip in far eastern parts of Arizona, but most folks in the state didn't get anything. We did squeak out one event later in the month that put down some heavy rain and hail in the northwest part of Tucson, but it was super localized. I just watched it from my couch. It was definitely a spectator sport kind of storm at that point. And we have to be real careful with this episode is that we call this the Southwest. New Mexico actually had a pretty reasonable October. I mean, they came in average to above average as parts of their state. It was really a breakdown right at the state line.
That's right.
The tales of two Octobers here in the Southwest. Man, it didn't break Arizona's way for sure.
Yeah, so at the Tucson airport, it has been since basically mid-August since we've had more than 1/10 of an inch.
Yeah.
There was a little trace or...
Do you want to think about those 3 weeks in July again? Should we just sort of visually...
We can't go back there, but those were
days.
memorable.
I know, you're counting down to those weeks.
7.5 months.
Yep.
October is not a month that we tend to get dry weather. I mean, the average October precipitation is close to an inch.
Yeah, but... that's pretty generous, though. October, we should have a pretty low bar. For October, the expectation is it's one of those months that has in its record, and as you go around the state, it has a couple of really wet months and is really skewed towards the dry. I think that's really because it is a transition month. You can sometimes get these tropical storms in the first 2 weeks of the month that can hammer the state. We can get some early winter type storms interacting with some subtropical moisture to put down some precip, but a lot of times it's just sort of transitioning.
But how
you're going to argue me, man?
Well,
right?
How different is that than
any other month?
Yeah.
Okay, so September, you're still reaching into subtropical moisture. I think you're still within your grasp. So you're getting some monsoon activity maybe early in the month, and then we're sort of transitioning. But October is really that month where you pivot from monsoon towards the winter type season. And in that process of pivoting, sometimes the moisture just isn't there. And sometimes you're just going to be dealing with dry storm systems sort of trailing across the state.
True. So if you look at the historical record that goes back to pre-1950, but 72 years of data, 13 of them have basically produced zero precipitation at the airport.
At the airport.
And to your point, the wettest 20 years actually produced precipitation that was 3/4 of an inch or greater. So only 20 years out of that 70 years produced rain that was that above the average that I mentioned a few moments ago.
And then you've got that on the far outer reaches of this. There's this little jump of those 3 years that become the record years or the extreme outliers. So 1972, definitely tropical storm. 2000, really weird year. Lots of tropical but frontal kind of cold fronty type storm, just like high frequency of rain events.
5 inches.
Yeah, 5 inches, but over many days. Sort of, it was like a very wet month. The rest of the season wasn't much at all. And then 1983 was Hurricane Octave. So decaying or tropical storm Octave by that point.
Octave?
You know what? That's probably more correct, isn't it? I'm from Michigan, so my Midwestern pronunciations are in full effect right here.
Let's not go into a pronunciation lesson here. I started us down the wrong path.
Thanks a lot.
But there was a tweet recently about October precipitation being only one of 5 events in historical record where there had been no precipitation. But if you kind of look a little bit deeper, again, 16 years have produced basically no precipitation. So there's a few years with trace values and a few years with 0.02, which, I mean...
Yeah, I'd argue it's not that rare.
Yeah, it's not that rare.
It's like what we did in August by getting real close to zero in all accounts. We didn't. We had a couple of events here or there, but there were places in the Southwest where we didn't get any precip in August. That's hard to do when you're in the core of the monsoon. So that to me stands out as more unusual than having a dry October. I think that and again, this varies around the region, and New Mexico did actually quite well with picking up some kind of frontal storms interacting with some subtropical moisture even out of the Gulf of Mexico. The story, I think, for Arizona and the broader Southwest is really the temperatures for October. That stands out as being unusual.
All right, so let's look at temperatures. Right, so the average temperature, the average anomaly was on the order of 5 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than average.
It's a lot.
And that's for basically the entire state of Arizona and even southwest New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Much of the state, then, it was in the top 10 percentile. A few records here and there in southeastern Arizona, but top 10 percentile.
Yeah, we got squeezed again. It's not all that unusual to what happened last October. We're kind of looking at the mid part of the month and comparing it to October 2016, which was the record warmest for Tucson in particular. And it really looked like we were going to be breaking the record once again this month. But there was really active jet stream pattern, a lot of low pressure systems sort of coming in through the Pacific Northwest and sliding into the Intermountain West. And actually Nevada and Utah and Wyoming and kind of areas north actually had average to below average October temps, while everything south of that and right at the Utah-Arizona border was sort of this break point where it's just slightly above average northern Arizona. And you get down to the deep southwest and sort of, as you said, southwest New Mexico and southern Arizona. Then we're into the places that were much above top 10% of October temperatures to isolated locations, including Tucson, where we're getting close to near record. Tucson proper didn't end up breaking last year's record, but came within 0.2 of a degree if we're talking about the 1948 through 2017 period of record.
Yeah, so the average this year was 77.3 degrees Fahrenheit, and last year was 77.5.
Right.
I think it's a tie.
There you go. Yep, put an asterisk.
Okay, so hot, dry. And what was the jet stream doing?
Wiggling all over the place. It was all over. It was going nuts. The jet stream was active. The jet stream has been active. We've seen jet stream activity through much of the summer. Actually, August into September, we were dealing with a suppressed monsoon ridge, and we were dealing with upper-level westerlies, and we continued to see much of the same pattern, starting to see deeper little low-pressure systems drop in to, as I said earlier, the Intermountain West, which was actually part of the reason you were starting to see those Santa Ana winds set up. And we had several easterly wind events here in southern Arizona, which also were part of the reason that we ended up having these high temps. Having easterly winds moving into the low deserts, coming out of New Mexico, moving into Arizona, can really keep our overnight temps up. And so min temps were up, which will end up boosting the averages as well.
Just going back a minute to our conversation about the average October, and yes, there's high variability. It's skewed toward the wetter, a few wetter Octobers in the record. But, zero precipitation puts us behind a little bit for the cool season precipitation. So we're in a deficit in October. We've been in, a deficit basically since the end of July's precipitation in the monsoon. So looking forward, November, see about the same amount of rainfall as we tend to see in October. So a little bit more than a half an inch, less than an inch. Basically, our December is somewhere around 1 inch too. So we get this sort of steady, it's not steady accumulation, obviously, but all the months sort of tally around the same amount.
Yeah. October, again, I never get too bothered by getting no October precip. I think that the thing that's a little bit more troubling, and we've certainly seen this happen with the drought monitor, is now really starting to bring the short-term drought conditions back in Arizona. That missing the October and September precip is a huge chunk out of the last 6 months, even 8 months. And not having October, I'm not panicking yet, but as we get into November, especially the later part of the month, you really do start to expect to see an event occurring. Get into December, a couple more events. And then by January, we're in the heart of it, and we really should be hoping to see some accumulation of precip. And I think, as you pointed out earlier, we look to last year, and we can maybe pivot into sort of the discussion of La Niña coming forward here, is last October, we were having a really similar conversation, right? We were kind of looking at this record. It was the record warmest October for Tucson and much of the Southwest, near record temperatures. Freaking out, right? La Niña in front of us. And November cooled off a bit. And then by December and January, we're actually into some weather systems and picked up some precip. Looking
around at the cities around the Southwest here, Phoenix picks up roughly 4.5 inches during the winter season. So between October and April, so counting all these 7 months together, 4.5 inches. Flagstaff picks up 13 inches. It receives more winter precipitation than summer precipitation in Flagstaff, as it does in Phoenix. Albuquerque receives about the same amount during these winter months as it does during the monsoon months. Tucson's roughly half and half, although slightly more for the monsoon. So we're 1 month into it. Obviously, as you mentioned before, that the October time is a transition season, so we shouldn't get overly concerned. But what are you looking forward to? I'm not going to ask you what you're predicting.
Oh,
what are you expecting?
Yeah, that's we don't say that word anymore, do we? Yeah, what am I expecting? Okay, so November is, we're leaning into winter right now, right? So we're quickly, the days are getting shorter, so we're actually now starting to see the temperatures moderate a bit, cool off. You expect to see the jet stream pattern climatologically now start to move its way down the West Coast. November is an interesting month for Seattle. Seattle has a bit of a precip maxima that emerges in November as the jet stream sort of settles in from the north, then settles a little bit further south, and then it will come back again and then give them a secondary maxima later in the season. So we're now expect to start to see some of those winter-type storm systems with precipitation work their way down into our region. But, it really is sort of a beginning of November towards a later part of November. I was looking at the Tucson records from last year, and at the beginning of November last year, we were in highs in the 80s, lows in the 60s. By the last month or the last day of November last year, we actually had a freezing event. So we had a low of 29 by November. So big changes typically are occurring over a pretty short temporal window as we're moving through November.
Yeah, so maybe we should just go back and recap what happened last year, because it was, and we can talk about this in a minute, but it was sort of a weak La Niña event. And for those who don't know, that the odds are in favor of dry conditions here in the Southwest, particularly in the southern parts of Arizona, New Mexico as well, Southern California, as sort of the dynamics are that the jet stream is sort of pushed a little bit further north, or it's prevented from ferrying in those cold storms from the Pacific Northwest, and we tend to be drier. Of course, there is indication that the strength of the La Niña event matters in this, and there was a weak event, and so there's a little bit more play at hand with the jet stream. But nonetheless, last year for Tucson basically came in at actually pretty dry. So the average is close to 5 inches and 3.31 inches. So an inch and a half. So 66% of average rain. Seemed like most of that was early on in the winter.
By this time last year, we'd already picked up about a half an inch of rain at Tucson. So we had sort of an early November event. And then I think the thing that was interesting about last year is that you got to the end of the season and you had to look at the data to be convinced that it was actually below average, because the middle part of the winter time was quite pleasant. And we had a lot of cloud cover, the actual count of precip events between October and May in Tucson was above average. We had 30 rain days. We see about 25 for that whole season. But the interesting thing was that the amount of precip we got on those 30 days totaled up to being below average precipitation. So it was a lot of light events relative. So if you think about it in that terms, getting precip early November, pretty frequent through December and January, not getting shut out in February or March is much better than we've done in previous years. So that weak La Niña, even coming in, a good 2 inches below average at the end of the season, it really wasn't terrible. So that's kind of the interesting thing, is that seasonal total didn't really tell the whole story. You went further north, Flagstaff eked out, I think, just slightly above average, had above average frequency of precipitation events, and that was kind of the case across the Southwest.
Yeah, Phoenix was close to average.
I would argue that some of the previous winters, even when we had strong La Niña, those working out sort of hydroclimatologically would have been more impactful than the way that this, from a drought perspective, than the way that last winter played out. And that was a weak La Niña event.
Now, people may remember that last year was characterized, at least in California, as a year that experienced a huge number of atmospheric rivers. Epic, I believe it was the most atmospheric rivers on record, and these are funnels of precipitation or moisture from the tropics that come in and drop some of the record-setting rainfall across California.
And I think we're getting a little bit of the leftovers from a lot of those events, so I think that they're not completely unrelated.
I don't know, Mike, if you know, are the atmospheric rivers tend to occur more often during neutral or weak La Niña events, or when the sort of atmosphere isn't strong enough to pull things one way or the other?
My understanding, and I don't know if this has necessarily changed in the research and literature, but that when atmospheric rivers are related, especially to Madden-Julian oscillations, is that the Madden-Julian oscillation, or MJO, can propagate in neutral to weak La Niña conditions more effectively towards the west. Because if the easterlies are weak, the MJO is typically weak, as difficult kind of moving around. And then if the easterlies are particularly strong during a strong La Niña event, then that can have an impact too. So I think that there's that connection. That's some literature from like 10 years ago, and I know that that's come a long way, but I think that still largely hangs together, and so it's probably fits together with the weak La Niña conditions of last year.
And so that's the expectation this year in terms of the La Niña being a weak La Niña. Like there's no strong indicators that that's going to change at all.
No, as you pointed out to me earlier, I was kind of thinking that last year I thought last year was a little bit weaker La Niña, and it turns out that we're actually even in a weaker spot this fall than we were last year. Is that right? Mm-hmm. That the La Niña peaked a little bit earlier and then crashed early in the winter, and that's almost a carbon copy forecast for what we're dealing with right now. It's even a bit weaker than it was last year, and I don't think it'll get to the magnitude that it was even last year as well. So it just from that one dimension of thinking about seasonal climate forecasting, just the one, and we know how many moving parts are that we don't quite have nailed down, but that makes it a pretty squishy forecast kind of going forward. Again, La Niña leaning dry for southern Arizona and southern New Mexico. It's probably reasonable forecast, but man, I think there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding it.
Yeah. So did you just say what the forecast was?
I didn't. I alluded to the fact that it is leaning very La Niña-ish in the sense that it's looking at the analog for typical La Niña, La Niña years, which is below average for...
The Climate Prediction Center's seasonal forecast for December through February does call for slightly increased chances for dry conditions in Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. And that's basically the La Niña imprint.
It's a subtle lean in the probability of the lower tercile, right? So it's not about the amount, and it's not anything more than if you're to carve up all your data into 3 groups, that you slightly have a better chance of being in that lower group.
Yeah, these things. Yeah, a slight. If you have 3 categories, it's a 33% chance in each category. But if you have, and you tilt the odds to one, in the below category to 40%, then the others slightly adjust. So it's 33 to 40% in the below tercile. It's around 33% in the middle tercile, and then a subsequent
there's
shift.
Still pretty good chances of those other ones happening too. I mean, that's the other way of sort of looking at that too.
That's true, but then if you flip it around and you say, okay, well, if you combine the middle and the lower, it's basically like a 60 to 70% chance that it's not going to be above.
Right.
Precipitation.
But near average ain't bad, I mean, and it's you can really carve these stats up in a lot of different ways, which is why we end up feeling so squishy about these things.
And then the forecast for temperature is a little bit stronger in sense of
trend.
The odds, and that's basically drawing on the trend.
It's most let's see, for this forecast it's going to be trend, and it's going to be the La Niña composites as well, because those having reduced frequency of those cool, wet days is going to end up helping boost your temps too. But that trend is in there as well. All
right. So what else?
Do we want to talk about the analogs, the weak La Niñas of the past?
Okay. So if you look at La Niña events in the past since 1950, there's been 22 spanning, the weak, the moderate, and the strong intensities. There's been 12 of those have been of the weak variety, which is what we're in. And, looking at the precipitation pattern during those weak events across the West, it kind of get a number of different flavors. I think what pops is a sort of canonical pattern: wet in the Pacific Northwest, dry in the Southern. But honestly, there's varieties there's many different varieties actually here. I think what swamps the signal is that when it's been wet in the Pacific Northwest, it's been really wet. And so that makes when you average these together, it looks like there's been a lot of rain up in Pacific Northwest on average in La Niña events, but it sort of obscures the fact that there has actually been a number of years where there's been dry conditions as well.
Yeah, I think that you look at those weak La Niña events for the continental U.S., the dry southeast kind of Gulf state La Niña signal really does pop a bit, as you say. It's a bit more of a mess when you get into the West and the Intermountain West. And then if we group in December, January, February precip of 2017, we call that weak La Niña. But the La Niña was really crashing at that point. And so by February, I think we were back in neutral conditions. So it's maybe why it wasn't sort of grouped into that. It's extraordinarily wet from New Mexico all the way up through the Northern Rockies, and then California's epic wet as well. So it's like all the West was really wet. Tucson, interesting. Southern Arizona kind of came in near average, but last year was really quite extraordinary from that perspective.
All right. Well, kind of just have to see how things unfold here.
Yeah, I think that maybe the take. Yeah, what is the take home here? The take home is we don't have any idea what we're talking about.
I think, but to your point before, I think October's a sort of a hard month.
Yeah, there's nothing. I don't think we can glean much out of.
I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go on record and say that October is the most uneventful month to talk about. What do you think about that?
May.
Yeah, but May. Yeah.
May zero. May nothing, man.
You get some extreme heat.
That's it. We had extreme heat, and that was boring this month. I mean, the October has potential, right? You can't get a tropical storm in May. This one just let us down. That's where I'm at. It went to the extreme unboringness. I mean, like it had to work hard at it, and all it could do is give us, near record temperatures, which was no fun.
All right. Well, we'll see what the weather does. We'll see how it.
Yeah.
We'll come back and
see if seasonal forecasting is of any utility at all.
All right, Mike. Well, it was good catching up with you.
It was a valiant effort.
I look forward to recapping November, getting into the heart of the winter, and taking it one day at a time.
One day at a time, even though we're climate people.
When climate wants to be weather.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to the November edition, and we'll see you in a month or so.
The
Southwest Climate Podcast is a production of CLIMAS, which is part of NOAA's Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program and is housed at the University of Arizona Institute of the Environment. Mike Crimmins is a principal investigator with CLIMAS, a professor of soil, water, and environmental science in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and climate extension specialist with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. Zack Guido is a research scientist with the Institute of the Environment and UA program manager of the International Research and Applications Program. The podcast is edited and produced by Ben McMahon, research, outreach, and assessment specialist with CLIMAS.
Can you edit in, Alexa, pronounce octave for me?
Octave.
They will. That'll be so awesome. Alexa, CPC forecast me.